Hello, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. And today we're going to be talking about herbs, and this is a class in a series called The Impatient Gardener. I'm going to go over several topics today, including different types of herbs, planting, growing herbs in containers and growing them inside, how to harvest, and also how to store them correctly. And I just wanted to go ahead and mention one great guide that I used for this class and for a lot of classes that I do is the Rodale Illustrated Encyclopedia of Herbs, which you can see to the right. And I've had that probably 15 years and I can't, I'm surprised the spine hasn't broken yet. So there's a lot of different kinds of herbs, and they can be broken down to a lot of different ways. There's annual and biennial and perennial. And when I think of annuals, I think of things like basil or dill or coriander. And perennials, more something like a mint, a sage, or a thyme. And so remember, an annual would be a plant that grows, that the seed is planted, it grows, and it produces seeds all in one season. And a perennial lives more than 2 years. There are also some plants that grow better in shade than in sun. And if you're finding that you have a landscape that's partially shaded, things like catnip, chives, oregano, parsley, or mint might be a good option for you. And, especially when we're talking about perennials, just go ahead and make sure and plan your garden placement of plants as best as you can prior to actually digging and planting the plants, because things like perennials will hopefully be there for more than 2 years. And you don't want to have a situation where you plant them and then 6 months later you realize it's a bad place and you have to move them. And so kind of think in terms of how to maybe even make like a map of where things will go. And I think long term that'll help. And also if you're looking at this from a design perspective, that would be a good idea as well. Another way to break down herbs is but I think we're going to talk about this today mostly, is the culinary and the kitchen herbs, which we think of primarily basil and sage. But it can also be medicinal, which is very interesting to read about, dyes, fragrance, and then also companion planting. And by companion planting, I mean that you are growing plants that either help each other grow or are antagonists to one another and can hurt the plant next to it. So very interesting topic if you have not read or researched that very much. So going back to planting, again, what do you want to grow? Do you want to grow things for your kitchen? Do you want to grow things maybe to attract pollinators? So find out what plants fit your needs, and then also what plants might grow well in your landscape. Before planting, I would add a few inches of compost to the area. That's just always a good idea. And when you're starting a new garden, and I would work up the soil to at least 8 to 12 inches. And here in Madison County, we have a lot of clay in our soil. And so if that's the case and you find that drainage is a problem, I would consider a raised bed. Or a lot of herbs actually also grow well in containers, which would be another option. Just some things that I've kind of picked up on over the years. Some plants do better if they're planted by seed versus being transplanted. And you go to the stores now and you can get a transplant for just about anything. But some plants, like cilantro is the one that comes to mind for me, that actually grows better if it's planted from the seed. It just doesn't transplant very well. And also, I mentioned already, to be sure to put the perennials in an area where they won't have to be disturbed. And also make sure that it is a perennial in our area. Something that is a perennial maybe in Florida may not survive the winter here. And so while it may in the South grow perennially, it may be a plant that needs to be brought in our winters, especially in our bad winters and our mild winters, it might survive. So do a little research on each plant, ideally, before you purchase the plant or the seeds. For the most part, a lot of herbs are pretty much pest and disease free. And from my research, I read again and again that one theory is because they tend to have a high level of aromatic oils. But I think they're still plants, and plants in general, if they're stressed or if they're growing in a bad area, are more likely to have some disease problems. And so a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, good drainage, which I've talked about again and again. But don't put your plants too close together because plants need good airflow. And the longer leaves are wet, the more likely they are to pick up maybe a fungal infection. So just make sure you're not planting them too closely together. And part of that is knowing how big the plant will be when it is fully mature. So anytime we are growing anything in a container, make sure that it has good drainage, which means good drainage holes in the pot. And the picture to the right, you can see that there's actually a saucer of some kind that the plant is sitting in. And that's great. I would just hope that it's not sitting so tightly that it's kind of impeding the flow of water through the pot. And so what you want to have happen is when you irrigate, you will water until water flows out the bottom. And so when you're getting ready to plant your herb into a container, I wouldn't use soil from the lawn or garden. Instead, I would probably fill it with something like potting soil and maybe perlite. And this would make a very porous growing area for it to grow in. And I already mentioned this again also, sorry to get ahead of myself, but sometimes perennial herbs like rosemary is the one I tend to think of, might be beneficial to be brought indoors during the winter. And if we have a very mild winter here, I'm always surprised at some of the plants that will make it in our landscaping, especially if they're up close to the house. But to be safe, some things just may die if we have a really bad cold snap. Growing herbs indoors is also popular and pretty easy for some plants. There's a list of herbs that do grow well inside. This is not the definitive list. I looked at a lot of different publications in my herb book, and there's a lot of different herbs that would grow well, lend themselves to growing well inside. So read a little more, maybe at the and research what might work for you. But again and again, I read, be sure to grow enough because, if you're growing one small pot of chives, you may use all of those chives very quickly. And so if that's an herb that you really like, then maybe grow more of it or more pots. And, when you start to grow herbs indoors, now you're not just growing herbs, you're growing a house plant is the way I'm looking at it. And so some things to think about, like we already mentioned with the pot outdoors, is you need to have good drainage holes. And I would still recommend potting soil, the same potting soil and maybe perlite from before. This is more of a house plant now, and so I would probably about once a month fertilize it at a half rate of what is recommended on the fertilizer that you're using. Different herbs, from what I've read, require slightly different sometimes watering needs. So some plants, for the most part, even house plants, sometimes the way to check to see if they're dry is to put your finger in the soil. And if it is dry there, then it's time to irrigate. But from what I've read, some herbs prefer to be drier than that, whereas some need more consistent moisture. And so it goes back again to doing your research. Now, one thing across the board is if you have yellow leaves, it can probably be a good indicator that you're actually watering too much. Yellow leaves might also mean a nitrogen deficiency. And while I don't have this on the slide, one other thing to consider is if you're overwatering or underwatering, a symptom is that the plant will look wilted. And I have found from talking to people that it's much more common to overwater plants than to underwater because people want them to survive and want to do such a good job that they tend to overlove their plants a little. Herbs need on average about 5 hours of sunlight. And again, we talked about this in a previous class. That's best done at a south or west facing window, or you can use a grow light. But if you're using a grow light, it will need to be on more than 5 hours. In fact, it'll need to be on more like 14 to 16 hours. And I hadn't really thought of this, but until I read it when I was researching for this class. But One thing to consider is turning the plants regularly so that it's getting sunlight on both sides and getting good even growth. Now, if you find that your plants are starting to have stems that seem long or elongated and you're not getting as many leaves, it is probably an indication that they are not receiving enough light. So you might want to reevaluate where they are, what window they're in, or you may need to add a supplemental light source. Plants do grow really well, and sometimes we have windows that are perfect for light, but what happens is it gets very cold outside, and our window panes, the glass in the windows become very cold, and so we don't want to put the plants right up against that because it could damage the foliage there. And I did read you could put a sheet of paper between the plant and the window. I do wonder if that would make a big enough difference, but that is something that I found people are doing. Plants also don't like dry air in general. For houseplants, that's the case. One thing to do would be to use trays and put small pebbles on the trays and then put water and then put plants on top of that. Misting the plants is an idea. And another idea is if you have multiple pots of plants, to put them close together, because I do think that that can help with humidity. And of course, one of the biggest reasons that we grow herbs is because we can harvest them and use them. So you want to harvest primarily in the morning after the dew dries, but before the heat of the day. And if you're trying to harvest for maximum essential oils, there is some additional guidelines on when to do that. Now, for leafy herbs, you want to harvest right before the buds open. For seed herbs, and I guess an example of this would be coriander. When seeds change from green to brown, and you don't want the seeds to become fully ripe on the plant, and cut the blooms just as the flower opens and store them in a paper bag. And if you're harvesting for flowers, you want to harvest just before full flowering. If you're harvesting the leaves for annuals, you want to cut them. They can be cut back pretty severely, but I would still leave at least a few inches, and ideally 4 to 6 inches. For perennials, don't remove more than a third of the top growth. And I thought this was a good point because perennials will be going through winter, ideally. You want to help them to prepare for those colder temperatures. And so don't harvest perennials for at least a month or 40 to 60 days before frost, and so they can harden off before winter. And again, 40 to 60 is a pretty big, broad spectrum of time. So I think that goes back again to some plants need more than others. And so as you're researching, if you need to contact me, I can help you decide what herbs might work for you, and for that matter, what garden plants in general. So we really don't want to, in general, wash the plants before we need to use them. And so when we do wash them, we want to use running water, and then we shake off the moisture, or we can use a salad spinner. If you're planning on drying the herbs, you can use a mist bottle and wipe them clean. If you're planning a short-term storage, you can store them in a refrigerator crisper, in a perforated bag, or even open, or you can snip the bottom of them at a diagonal and put them in a glass with about 1 inch of water, which I think is also the way that you can store asparagus. But do be aware, the longer herbs are stored, the more the flavor diminishes. For long-term storage, you want to keep them in airtight containers in a cool, dry location. And I would try I think it would be best if you could actually use containers that are dark, or maybe even wrapped in paper so that light doesn't break down the oils as quickly. So dark containers would work best. And also keep them away from heated areas, which would also make them decline faster. So if you're drying your plants, you want to dry them in a dark and breezy location. And to keep them dust-free, cover them with brown paper bags. You want to strip leaves and dry on a screen is another option, or you can even dry in an oven, a microwave, or a dehydrator. In Kentucky, we really are a little bit too humid in the summers to really have great dehydration, like outside. And a lot of times people want to put like a tarp over a car and then maybe put the cut tomatoes and have them dehydrate. But we're really too humid, and so sometimes the dehydration doesn't work properly. So for good dehydration to work, I would probably go ahead and use a dehydrator versus putting them outside to dry. For freezing, you can actually freeze different herbs together. Like if you have a certain recipe, you can actually mince them together and freeze them in ice trays. You can do this by also pureeing them and then putting them in, or even whole sprigs. You could either, I think this would work best for me, is probably keep them in the ice trays and freeze them that way and have them designated as herbs. Or what you could do is pop them out and put them in bags and make sure and just date the day that you froze them. Now, if you do think that it might be over 2 months before you use them, I would go ahead and blanch them in boiling water for about 45 seconds. So that was a lot of information to go over, I know, in kind of a short amount of time. But if you have any questions, my name is Amanda Sears, and I'm the horticulture agent here in Madison County, Kentucky. And my number is 623-4072. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to talk to you either about the topic today, so about herbs or gardening in general. And thank you for your time and have a great day. Bye.